Okay, wonderful. I think we have quorum. So welcome everyone to today's session of the Conversations on South Asia series. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I'm the faculty coordinator for this year's conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and lecturer in art history here at Dartmouth. I'll say a bit about the conversation series. The series is hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth, each of whom select books published during the past 2 years for a panel of scholars to discuss. So we in the South Asian Studies Collective are especially excited to be hosting today's conversation about Naisargi Davé's new book, Indifference, on the Praxis of Interspecies Being, published in 2023 by Duke University Press. Following introductions by Dartmouth professor Nikhil Pandey, Naisargi Davé will begin by presenting her book, after which Radhika Govindrajan and Kajri Jain will provide their responses. Before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgments about the series. First, I want to make everyone aware of our final conversation series event during the spring quarter. It's going to take place on May 15th and will feature Akriti Mandvani's book, Everyday Reading, Middlebrow Magazines, and Book Publishing in Post-Independence India. So do look for sign-up information in our email correspondence, website, and social media accounts. We'll also be putting sign-up information in the chat. Secondly, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the BODAS Fund for South Asian Programming here at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two BODAS student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritala Saravanan, for helping organize today's conversation. Lastly, thank you to Hope Rennie in the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with the series. Really, without these three people, we couldn't run the series. So one overall reminder to webinar attendees, please leave your comments in the Q&A box, not the chat. I'd like to now introduce Nikhil Pandey, our moderator for today's conversation. Nikhil Pandey is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. A sociocultural anthropologist and interdisciplinary scholar of caste, racialization, decolonization, health, sexuality, and queerness from India, he completed his PhD in anthropology from Princeton University. Nikhil is also a literary translator of anti-caste and queer writings from India, for which he has received a PEN Translates Award from English PEN. His ethnographically assembled, edited, and translated anthology of short stories entitled Love in the Time of Caste is forthcoming from Zuban Books in 2025, Zuban being India's leading feminist press. He's also currently working on his first academic monograph. And with that, I'll hand things over to Nikhil. Nikhil, thank you for moderating today's conversation.
Thank you, Kurt, and welcome everyone to the Conversations on South Asia series. It is my personal pleasure and privilege to be welcoming the panel today to discuss Professor Naisargi Davé's book, Indifference. I'm going to introduce the speakers today in the order that they will be speaking. So let me jump straight to that. Naisargi N. Davé is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her work concerns intra- and interspecies ethics, politics, and relationality in contemporary India. Davé is the author of Indifference on the Praxis of Interspecies Being and of Queer Activism in India, a story of in the anthropology of ethics. 2012, the winner of the Ruth Benedict Prize, both from Duke University Press. Naisargi is currently working on a third book, Murder, the Social Life of Violent Death. Welcome, Naisargi. Radhika Govindrajan is an associate professor of anthropology and international studies at the University of Washington. She's the author of Animal Intimacies, Interspecies Relatedness in India's Central Himalayas. She's currently working on a book that explores how the political economy of sex is fundamental in shaping not just rural social relations, but the very idea of the village in South Asia. Welcome, Radhika. And Kajri Jain is Professor of Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Toronto. Her work on the interface between art, religion, politics, caste, and vernacular business cultures in modern and contemporary India includes Gods in the Bazaar, The Economies of Indian Calendar Art on Popular Prints, that's with Duke University Press 2007, and Gods in the Time of Democracy on the Emergence of Monumental Statues alongside Economic Liberalization. That's also with Duke University Press 2021. She also writes on contemporary art and on the discipline of art history, most recently the Routledge Companion to Decolonizing Art History 2023. Welcome, Kadri. The format is that we'll invite Naisargi to present for about 10 to 12 minutes, after which our two respondents, Radhika and Kadri, will have about 10 minutes to share their thoughts. And after the author has responded to those comments, we will open, of course, to everyone's comments. Another sort of reminder, as Kurt said, please put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. So with that, Naisargi, take it away.
Thank you, Nikhil and Kurt, for organizing. It's such an honor to talk about my book with Kadri and Radhika, both very important interlocutors for the text itself. So this is really a delight. Thank you both. Let me begin by just showing a few images that I'll then put aside as I'm reading, just to give you a little bit of a taste for the book. I should mention, as Kadri pointed out earlier, there aren't actually any photographs in the book itself. These are images from Chapter 2, Biography, Why is Moral Attention to the Animal So Repugnant? It answers that question through a braided biography of these three women welfarists in India during the Second World War. These images are from Chapter 4, Sound, Can the Subaltern Be Silent? Which seeks to demonstrate the need to respect the chosen silence of animals as acts of political will. This is one of my favorite images. It's from Chapter 6, Can Indifference Be the Basis for an Ethical Engagement with the World? In which a group of men watch a one-eyed cat being treated by a welfare worker on the side of the street. This photo is by an artist named Sujatra Ghosh. In Chapter 7, What Does Cow Protection Protect? My co-writer Alok Gupta and I argue that cow protection protects the exclusive Hindu anthropatriarchal right to bestial encounters, that is to say, to dairying, to artificial insemination, and to the sterilization of free-roaming animals. This is a central image for the book. It shows up first in Chapter 3, Contradiction. How is the otherwise exhausted? This gentleman is Anil Sahni. He's a sausage maker or a further processor whom we meet in Chapter 8. This is just a Mumbai doggy. And finally, empty crates on a winter afternoon at the Ghazipur poultry market. So what I'll do to introduce the book is to read a bit from the introduction. It's about a 10-minute long selection. This is the very first page. I am not, I like to think, an indifferent person, and nor is this an indifferent book. By indifference, I mean living with others in their otherness, such that human and non-human animals might flourish in imminent encounters. Indifference to differences and indifference to the thatness of others. Not acquiring, not desiring, not assimilating, not repairing, not consuming, not anthropologizing, not staring. Indifference is the posture of immersion side by side, rather than the face-to-face. Indifference is not normally thought of highly. As queer theorist Madhvi Menon says, it conjures images of slouchy shrugs among other signs of apathy. Yet these impressions are often tinged with a revealing envy for the insouciance of youth, or worse, racist, elitist, and ableist disdain for people going about their own business. Yet in my understanding of indifference, indifference is not a lack, but a stance, a cultivated demeanor that is born of the queer desire and the queer belief in an otherwise way of being. Let's be honest, there is no shortage of the opposite of indifference in our world, which is the desire for difference, finding, wrangling, and utilizing it. And where has this gotten us? Anthropology, heterosexuality, capitalism, empire? Friends, I think we can do better. This next section of the introduction is titled For Opacity. Curiosity is a trait often held in high regard, particularly among intellectuals, with its opposite, being incurious, viewed as a sign of dereliction. It must be 20 years now since I read an essay about Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which argued that we know Humbert is a sociopath when he comes upon a glass cabinet of mounted butterflies and fails to examine it. I was troubled by this claim, besides having to now wonder whether I might be a sociopath, an always unwelcome interpolation. I wondered at this premise that one's goodness is demonstrated by an interest in pinned butterfly carcasses. It's not Humbert I am trying to redeem. I confess I've never managed to appreciate Lolita, but I am trying to redeem incuriosity. Curiosity is the foundation of anthropology, so fundamental that it is our common sense, normalized, not subject to much comment. But it has been a more explicitly valued disposition in multi-species anthropology, attributable, I think, to the field-defining work of Donna Haraway, who believes that we do better by going forth, forming knots, quote, with actual animals and people looking back at each other. A central precept of multi-species ethnography is this, that we be curious, that we look, and that we accept that being a being in this entangled world means being eaten by one another, eyes and mouth, fist and heart. When I read Haraway's text most recently, it is one of those books always on or near my desk. I had just that morning listened to a talk by Fred Moten. Moten describes how, in his childhood neighborhood, there were no fighting words quite like, "What are you looking at? Are you looking at me?" And I was reminded of Milan Kundera, who writes in Immortality that, quote, looks were like weights that pressed her down to the ground. Every day we are stabbed by thousands of looks. I think, too, of a moment Audre Lorde relates in Sister Outsider, in which she is stared at in her inexpensive winter coat by a white woman on a train, and Lorde feels the recoil, the otherness, the whiteness of curiosity. I can say for myself that, as a dyke, the curious gaze of normal people is rarely a pleasure. Are you looking at me? Shouldn't we at least have a say in who eats us? An alternative to the curiosity ethos is provided by the Martinican French poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant. In Poetics of Relation, Glissant issues a demand for opacity. We clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. Glissant contrasts opacity with the driver of Western thought, transparency, an epistemological and moral motivation that manifests through grasping and reduction, conquest and ingestion. I'm reminded of that glass case in Nabokov. But now we see this Glissantian respect for mutual forms of opacity, this clamor for the right to it, increasingly in the turn of this latest century, in anthropology and the arts. Perhaps fewer of us are dying of, or more to the point, being picked off by, the curiosity of others. The clamor for opacity sounds in the work of the abstract expressionist Julie Meritou, a queer Ethiopian-born artist whose refusals of figuration are a direct homage to Glissant. The clamor animates Audra Simpson's ethnographic refusals, Savannah Shangai's Black Girl methodology, in which, quote, you can follow me, but I'm not going to talk to you. It's in Julietta Singh's unthinking mastery, Denise Riles's right to be lonely, in Fran Tonkis's right to the, quote, precarious freedom of the fragile trust in the indifference of others. It's in Paul B. Preciado's ephemeral brush in his trans man's body with universality, a, quote, peaceful and anonymous place where everyone leaves you the fuck alone, unquote. As for my identity, I'll take care of that myself. It is in Mate Candea's Interpatience, quote, in active cultivation of inaction. Imagining life from the perspective of a lab-bound meerkat, Candea suggests, quote, ignoring another living being emerges as a positive achievement in a world of predation, unquote. The ethos hums too in Audre Lorde's love poem for Judith. Hanging out means being together upon the earth. Boulders, crepe myrtle trees, fox and deer, at the watering hole. Not quite together, but learning each other's ways. There is a curiosity here, yes, an awareness of other others who pose risk in promise, or maybe simply beauty. We might call this being together, not quite together, in our beloved thatnesses, a relation of unfolding imminence. Indifference is not the antithesis of relationality or the antithesis to relations of care. In fact, it is among the central beliefs of this book that care is born first of indifference, out of respect for the opaque thatness of the object other. The ethos of indifference, and not desiring to do anything with, for, and via the difference of others, is for me a response to what I think of as compulsory intimacy, which tends to make a post-humanist virtue of mixing, when folks might rather be left alone, and in that being let alone, thrive in relations of regard. My understanding of indifference is relational, of mutually existing indifference, rather than being different beings seeking to grasp, gaze, admire, and master the difference of others. This book is about the praxis of being that exists there at Audre Lorde's watering hole, one of awareness of and response to the presences of opaque others. And in that, indifference argues for and tries to enact an interspecies relational ethic premised on mutual regard, rather than curiosity, love, or animus. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nais, for that beautiful reading. I'm tempted to give you my 10 minutes just so I can hear you read more. But also thank you, Kurt, thank you, Nikhil, and thank you, Navya, for organizing this. It really is such a pleasure to be here. I just want to say, because Naisargi's work has been so foundational to my own. And every time I find myself at an impasse, I go back and dip into one of your two books, and I find that it always takes me somewhere. And so it's just a real pleasure to be here and an honor. This is the second or third time that I was reading the book. And I think every time I read it with different moments in mind. And I've been teaching a course on anthropology recently. And so I read this as a book about anthropology and an offering to anthropology, which is where Nais ends the introduction. She says, this is my offering for an anthropology after the fire, an anthropology at the watering hole, not quite together, but learning each other's ways. And as you just heard, that idea of anthropology at the watering hole comes from Audre Lorde's poem for Judith, which Naisargi just read, but I want to read again because it is so beautiful and I want to print it out and read it every day. Hanging out means being together upon the earth. Boulders, crepe myrtle trees, fox and deer at the watering hole, not quite together, but learning each other's ways. And I thought that hanging out was such an apt connection to anthropology, because very often anthropology graduate students are told, go hang out with people, right? Hang out and your topic will come to you. But it is that so much of that, as Naisargi said, is also predicated upon a particular kind of curiosity. So there were moments when I was reading this, and even though there are parts where this is about an interspecies relational ethic, I really read the interspecies relational ethic as also being a comment on anthropology. Anthropology of the watering hole is so tempting, and it makes me want to go line up at the watering hole. So I wanted to stop and say a little bit about what that entails. And some of this will be repeating what Naisargi just said, but I think it's worth holding on to, particularly because this question of what to do with anthropology and whether one should do it at all has really burned up the discipline, right? It's not a coincidence that Naisargi says this is an anthropology after the fire. There was a very popular piece from a few years ago that made a case for letting anthropology burn. But that question of what happens once it burns, I think, comes up in this book. Where do we gather? How do we gather? And we gather without curiosity, but with care, as Naisargi said. We gather with a regard for unfolding immanence. This is something that comes up in the book several times, that what an ethic that forsakes curiosity could look like would be an ethics of unfolding immanence, which is indifferent to continuity, indifferent to consistency, which I love. This is a delightfully inconsistent book in the sense that it reminds you that you don't have to follow the same thread through, and you can actually have these excursions from the watering hole into different parts and regather. And it's just a delight to read. So please do go out and read it. But it's also indifferent to conviction. No single moment produces a longer thread of conviction, right? And at some point in chapter 4, Naisargi says that this would be an ethics of immanence in which every moment would be its own ethical universe. Every moment would be enough in itself and doesn't necessarily have to lead out to an ethics that stays in a particular way. What stays with you might shift. And I find that quite compelling too, as a call for anthropology, one that does forsake its commitment to creating narratives that last, or to producing any kind of certainty, one that is content to be where it is in mutual regard with others, with respect for the opaque thatness of an object other, one that is mutually existing in difference rather than seeking to master difference, to grasp it, to gaze at it, to admire it even, or to master it. This is also an anthropology that cares tremendously for the survival and thriving of animal and human others. And that was something that I wanted to come back to, because indifference can often, as Naisargi said, imply a lack of care. But this is a very caring book. And I think with that, I wanted to take on two questions that I hope we could talk about and that I would love to have you discuss, which is one, what happens when an ethic of indifference encounters a politics of difference? And I've been thinking of that a lot recently because this question of recognition and refusal, which is also at the heart of this book. Naisargi brings up Audra Simpson's idea of refusal, the evacuating the desire for recognition as being part of an anthropology. And yet in the worlds that we inhabit, recognition and refusal go hand in hand. And I was wondering, Nais, if you would enter into conversation with some of the broader work on questions of recognition and refusal in South Asian studies. And I've been thinking of Dolly Keekon's work around food, for example, in particular, and fermentation and what it means to claim recognition and to refuse opacity, in a sense. And that made me think also of who can claim opacity and when is opacity the norm. And I've been thinking about that recently with the work of Dalit food historians who've been, and someone I've been reading is Janvi Upaleti, who has this wonderful book or a wonderful piece called I Like Beef and I Cannot Lie, which is really about the imposition of opacity on Dalit people's food, on their lives, and what it meant to come out and claim that this is history, this is memory, this is love, and that this is not a moment of indifference. And I think what you're pointing us to is that that is not an extraction of difference. That might be an assertion of difference, but it's not an extraction of difference. And that one has to sit alongside that form of difference. But I'm curious, when you were doing this work, if the ethic of indifference encountered in inconsistent and contradictory ways that politics of difference, that really does animate so much of the contemporary move against fascism or other isms in India at the moment. And I also wanted to ask you a question about the supernatural. There's this fantastic chapter, right, in Crystal Rogers, and when she passes away, people find this mildewed stack of books on the supernatural. And you have this intriguing footnote that talks about animal ghosts. But where is the supernatural in this as a form? What forms of indifference does that move outside allow us to imagine? And finally, I had a question about methods. And I think, again, this is something that I've been thinking of a lot as I teach, because I want to teach this book and I want to teach this as an example of a method that allows us to get away from curiosity. And there are several sections that I marked as I was reading this and thinking of teaching, where one, you talk about this, your method is following intuitions. You went where you were invited, you said yes to who and what turned up, and things just moved on from there, which I love. And I think that this is, in that sense, a very intuitive book, and it allows us to follow your intuition down all kinds of paths. But you also say that ethnography, like literature, should offer insights into ethical questions that resonate beyond culture, species, or periodization, even if their resonance and relevance have limits, and that you're interested in actions that generate their own queer context rather than being shaped by their frame. And I was really struck by that, and I went back to that over and over again and tried to think of what that would mean methodologically, to not be dictated by frame. And if I might use a word that comes up in the book, and I think Kadri might talk about this too, context, right? In a sense that the idea that context is something that one can take up, but that one should also sort of set aside. And I'm just curious what that looked like methodologically for you, because this is such a spectacular book. It's such a model, I think, for an anthropology after the fire. And I would love to hear just more concretely what doing an indifferent anthropology looks like, and how does one forsake curiosity? And I say this perhaps as a curious person, and I came away feeling a deep sense of shame about my own curiosity, but I'm curious about what an incurious anthropology might look like. But really, thank you for this gift of a book. I know I'll go back and read it many, many more times, and we'll always have new questions for it and for you. Thank you.
I hope you'll allow me to unmute just long enough to say thank you, Radhika, for those wonderful comments.
Hey, I think it's my turn. So thank you so much again for inviting me to think with this extraordinary book and these amazing people. So as an art historian, I want to tarry with the aesthetics of indifference, not just because it's a fantastically enjoyable read, it's elegant, impressively literary, gripping, moving, startlingly poetic, witty, and as sprinkled with allusions for theory buffs as a Tarantino film is for film buffs. And it's funny. The most densely theoretical chapter is shot through with scatology, down to a pun in the footnotes about analysis. But also, as Nais says, and we just heard this from Radhika too, I'm drawn towards actions that generate their own queer contexts rather than being shaped first by their frame. Sounds a lot like art to me. So there's a kinship between the ethical attitude or sensibility of indifference here, queerness, and the Kantian aesthetic with its commitment to non-purposive, to the non-purposive, although that has a kind of nature-given purposiveness. And so we might want to talk about how you see the relationship between ethics and aesthetics, and if you even see a distinction between them. So the last sentence on page 1 that we heard sets the tone, encapsulating how the book's substance, style, and spirit are one and the same. Friends, I think we can do better. Friends, think we can do better. This is friendly, conversational, respectful, modest, ambitious, and deeply philosophical all at once. For the I think here is not the cogito that founds Cartesian being. Before the Sophia in philosophy came to signify a more abstract wisdom, it meant expertise in a specific domain of knowledge or craft. So this book is and is about that kind of philosophy, the love of thought as and about specific kinds of doing, which, as we learn, is inseparable from being as becoming. And it's also about doing better. Ethics, an ethics of being in relation that seeks something other than the wars of difference that surround us and hobble us. And here, the better question is not so much, is it X, but must it be X? There's a lot of despair here, yet people go on. As some go on butchering, torturing, and neglecting, others go on tending. Indifference tells us about both, but learns from being with the latter, those who've surrendered to the call for better doing of relation, in this case to animals, which is also a becoming in relation. The book proceeds through the form of doing and being whose close attention to practices we call ethnography. It also works with other practices, mostly literature and philosophy, along with other ethnographies, queer theory, Black studies, feminism, biography, law, and walking. The first half of Indifference dwells with animalists, quote, people who act politically alongside and on behalf of animals. So it provides historical context for broadly secular, organized animal welfare in India and its illiberal obverse, cow protection. And here we meet charismatic but often exhausted individuals, historical and contemporary, who have dedicated their lives to those of animals. And we saw some pictures of them at the beginning. These exemplary figures exert a gravitational pull on the narrative, drawing us into the theoretical discussion and lived instantiation of indifference at the heart of the book. And that's where we encounter what I call in my clunky shorthand, the three cons. Can you see them? Okay, so this is what impedes ethical responsiveness, okay? Contradiction, which is like posing logical contradiction as a paralyzing hindrance to action. It's like, you know, how come you're doing this when you also do that? Then we have consistency, the demand for sameness, and context, which is basically sort of reinforcing pre-formatted frames and what Nace calls predictable lines of force. And about now, in the middle of the book, is when you realize there's a kind of formal rhythm here, as what looks like an argument is elaborated only to be punctured by what Nace calls an oblique cut. Not an antithesis or refutation exactly, but more a contrapposto, that twisty, asymmetrical, off-kilter posture that suggests turning and signify ease, grace, style, or indeed indifference, becoming otherwise, queering, a break. So, thus armed with indifference to contradiction, rather, I should say, disarmed, like Apollo, who also figures in the book, we're led to the grisly abattoirs, breeding pens, farms, butchers' shops, animal transports, and battery cages of the book's second half. As the quiet image of Nace asleep one afternoon after the abattoir, exhausted, still in her bloody socks, brings home, she spent hours and hours with suffering or dying animals, and with those either leading them to their death or warding it off. And she describes these stomach-curdling horrors calmly, meticulously, without obvious sentiment, passion, or pity, in keeping with the ethics of indifference that she describes. And I say describes, not advocates or theorizes, for this isn't a project of activism or theory as much as of ekphrasis, the close description whose own art revivifies that of its object. This resonates, I think, with the ethnographic method and with the focus on indifferent, unpreformatted attention to the lived world as the driver of theory, rather than trying to cram the world into given templates of theory or context. This lively description of what's already there is what makes the book's aesthetic craft and ethnographic ethical responsiveness inseparable from its argument, if we can call it that, about immanent ethics. And that isn't meant as a diss, but wants to take seriously the stated aim of eschewing warring positions via the contrapposto form. This tuning into immanence is what makes this book about what Nace calls, quote, intraordinary performances of relation, so extraordinary. The book and these practices are extraordinary in both senses of extra. They're above and beyond the ordinary, if the ordinary is normal or normopathic, that which weaponizes logic to serve anti-life forces. Such cynical reason institutes a war in a lived world that isn't in fact carved up into neatly opposing positions. So that's ethnography, right? It's like looking at things the way they are. And in this sense, the practices in and of the book are also extraordinary, in the everyday sense of extra as even more. They're even more ordinary than we realize, supernormal. Because the lived world is full of paradoxes and contradictions and doesn't conform to logical distinctions, not least those between animals and humans. It takes violent work, passionate investment, and dogged accumulation to keep distinctions in place, to script leak-proof moral programs, and to stick to them consistently. So indifference is, as I said, disarming. It charms us and takes away our weapons, dismantling in advance any moves that we might make to critique it. Most critical responses readily fall into one of the three cons: contradiction, consistency, and context. And so they sound like shallow, ethically bankrupt whataboutism. This is an oddly liberating feeling. What it does, at least to me, is to elicit a surrender to aesthetic delight in the bracingly fresh form and flow of these counterintuitive ideas. And I'll just end by saying that perhaps at this moment we need this more than ever, because it deals with being in relation as all the givens go up in smoke. Even as it decries the tyranny of context, indifference actually does inhabit a time and place. It's the time of the chicken, and we're at the watering hole where beings are gathering to escape the fires. Creatures running from butchers and animal husbands and climate catastrophe. Humans running from cow protectors and human husbands and climate catastrophe, but also from the burning fires of anthropology and any other discipline we care to name. Let me throw in art history. So we're hanging out alongside at the watering hole, being in our skin and our senses and doing what's vital, which is to say what amplifies life. But rather than lamenting lost certainties, indifference wants to hasten their demise by shaking off the performative instrumentalization of the desire for difference and rituals of ethics and care. So is it really so terrible that we could be at the end of global capitalism as we know it? This book prepares us how to imagine how to be at such a time.
I just want to briefly jump in. Thank you, everybody, for those deeply luminous presentations. I just want to urge the audience to keep their questions coming in the Q&A box. Nes, over to you.
Wow, I'm overwhelmed. Thank you for those incredible comments, both of you, Radhika and Kadri. Such deep and thoughtful readings and such beautiful engagements with the content and the form, and I really appreciate it. Let me try to sort of work through these questions, I suppose, in some kind of order. I'll maybe start with Radhika's questions, and then we can open it up to a larger discussion. So the first question I heard from you, Radhika, was around what happens when an ethics of indifference confronts a politics of difference, which is such a beautiful way of putting the problem of that particular kind of confrontation, which I think is the confrontation that frames that book, right? It exists within a politics of difference. And what does it mean to advocate for, to think alongside, and to think with a politics, an ethics of indifference? And the question of politics and the political is certainly present throughout the book, even though it's most explicit, I think, in that chapter on contradiction and context. So one thing that indifference means for me is very rarely a position of being against something. That, I think, is what is so fertile about that space of indifference, right? It doesn't mean refusing recognition. And it doesn't mean refusing the political, right? It's not apolitical. And I deliberately use this concept that I borrow from Julietta Singh's on thinking mastery of the depolitical, right? Which is just refusing to be sort of spoken for in advance by existing lines of thought and expression, right? Now, opacity, like indifference, and this is one of the things that I like about the concept of indifference, is the multiple plays of the term, I think, have two possible meanings, right? Let's take opacity first. In the vernacular, like everyday sense, opacity means to not let in, right? And in that respect, I think it is the very basis for political collectivity as we normally know it, right? The kind of sterile forms of political collectivity in which we must be loyal to the group and keep things within, and to form positions and ideologies that then become, they attain a stability that they don't inherently have because we become passionately attached to them, right? Glissant, I think, means something very different by opacity. It doesn't mean to not let in. It means a commitment to the freedom to always become otherwise, right? And so that kind of, that opacity doesn't necessarily mean an inability to engage with the politics of recognition or the politics of indifference, so long as that desire to adhere to that freedom to always become otherwise, which I think is the ground for genuine collectivity, right? Not this stale kind of political collectivity that is so bound by a real attachment to conceptuality and stale forms of political identity. this question about the supernatural, where is the supernatural in the book? Of course, as you point out, it's in The Ghost of Crystal Rogers X. And otherwise, I suppose it's a pretty terrestrial text in so many ways. But when you asked that question, I started to think, there's a way of thinking about any kind of philosophical engagement with the question of ethics. What are we up to in this life? What are we doing? They're supernatural questions in a way, right? They engage the problem of what do our actions mean and what are the consequences of them in ways that we cannot readily see and recognize, right? So it's not supernatural necessarily in the sense of, the ghost, but it does assume a certain kind of futurity and existence to the world that is real outside of ourselves and after we exist in the world, right? So that kind of ongoingness, which, to get back to another question that you asked, Radhika, about the every moment being its own ethical universe. And that too, I think it's evocative. And at the same time, for all of us who are engaged with the political in different ways, it's also a very kind of uncomfortable ask, right? Because we are always sort of building with futures in mind. But I think one of the things that I can say about Indifference is that for me, the concept of ongoingness is far more resonant than futurity. I think futurity is so, it's all wrapped up, I think, in the event and eventfulness, in a real respect for tenses, the past, the present, the future. And ongoingness, what I like about it is the way in which the beginning and the end are all kind of connected with each other. And so, yeah, that's how I think. I mean, I haven't thought this question through, but I'm interested in thinking more about how ethical questions are always sort of asking questions about the afterlife, even, or our afterlives. In terms of methods, and I so appreciate this read of the book, not only, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, about interspecies relations, but as a book about anthropology, and how to do it in this moment, and what the discipline offers. And for all of my little jabs at anthropology in the book, I can't imagine being in another discipline. I love being an anthropologist. I love what it allows. I love the capaciousness of thinking. I love the inherent interdisciplinarity to it. And so it is, they are a set of comments that come from real love and belonging, and even a commitment, I think, to the discipline. And in terms of methods, what are the methods of indifference? One, as you pointed out, Radhika, that line that I borrow from the historian Susan Buck-Morss, that it's about intuition, right? That my intuition is more sort of what generates the archive of the book. I go where I'm invited. I say yes to anyone who, wants me to do something. And that itself, I think, it brings two concepts that are central to indifference into conversation with each other. One of them is Derridean radical hospitality, right? The idea of saying yes to who and what comes up. Being able to receive that kind of hospitality and also to be able to give it. And for me, to be able to give that kind of hospitality, the saying yes to who and what comes up, is fundamentally about being indifferent to the ostensible boundedness of the categories of investigation, right? And so that's why, for me, this book, it's a book about queerness, it's a book about animals, it's a book about caste and anti-caste politics. It's about all of these things because, for me, a book about animals is also a queer book, right? And a queer book is also so fundamentally about interspecies and odd kinships and all of these other kinds of things. And so that, to me, is one of the ways in which indifference works as a method. It's an indifference to the boundedness of concepts. And then I think this question of receptivity then moves nicely into Kadri's question around ethics and aesthetics, right? So on the aesthetic question, I absolutely think that ethics and aesthetics are very much bound up with each other in general. And as you pointed out, Kadri, very much in the book itself. And I think I have to rely on a lot of quotations in order to think through this question. But one of them for me is this idea from Marilyn Strathern that I really love, in which she defines the image as an entity that is momentarily precluded from explanation. And so Indifference, even though there are no images in the book, it is a book that is built of images in the Strathernian sense, of these entities that do not require continuity, right? Or even ongoingness in a normative sense, and are momentarily precluded from explanation. So that they do work on their own, as opposed to being the object of my work, right? So that's one of the ways in which the ethical and the aesthetic, I think, are so important. I think we can really only get at ethical questions when we put sort of when we put the image first, I'll say that. Another quote that I'll use to think about this is Walter Benjamin, who said that laughter is the underside of mourning. And as you pointed out, Kadri, the book is comprised of hours and hours of encountering, violence against, human animals, non-human animals. And so it's really important to me, and there's nothing I love hearing more than someone who tells me that they laughed a lot when they read the book and found it funny, right? And because I do think, as Benjamin said, that levity isn't something other than real grief for and with and alongside the world, but it's another way into it, right? It's the underside of mourning. And so I think that humor for me is also, just in an aesthetic level, a way of, maybe also, as you're saying, Kadri, of disarming, but allowing for a different kind of receptivity to images that would otherwise be so quick to make us turn away, right? So it's about, producing a kind of, allowing for a kind of a stickiness or inhabiting the material through the laughter. Yes, I think that's all of the questions that I wrote down anyway. And if there's something I missed, please tell me.
I would at this point like to come in and ask our two sort of commentators, Radhika and Kadri, whether they'd like to respond to some comments that Nais made or sort of draw out a few other themes while I sort of sift through the questions.
I just wanted to say it was really nice that, Radhika, that you brought out that thing of the supernatural, because it does also put a question mark over the natural, which is part of the queerness of the book, right? It's like, what is this nature that seems so given? So I like that, the way you took supernatural in that direction of, well, it's other than natural.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
that
I love that too, and I
emerges
think
from the book, yeah.
Yeah, I love that response too. And I think the question I really wanted to ask was, what is the ghost that not, if not haunts, the sort of the ghost that's invited in that is at the heart of this book? But I also just love the idea that ethics is the kind of supernatural question. And I think that's that frames so much of how you think through this. I also love the idea of indifference as radical hospitality. And that is a kind of method, because I think that's something that is, as you said, one of the good things about the discipline, right? In the catalog of its many faults. And something to cultivate.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And that's, and the idea of radical hospitality is something that emerged for me very much as I was writing my first book, right? Just the way in which, every door was open just by virtue of being a queer person, and I thought it was phenomenal. And it's not a hospitality that then doesn't have, it's not unconditional. I think that's important too. There's a rigor to it, right? So I'm invited in, but then there are expectations of how I need to be, like what it means to care for others and to be in community with others, right? And so that aspect of the radical hospitality, that it's not necessarily unconditional, but there's a rigor of care and commitment, that too seems important to me in thinking through indifference as both a method and an ethical stance.
I won't ask if there are questions waiting, but at some point I would love to talk to you about that first book and the second book, because there is such a methodological movement. And yet, as you said, I think there are these forms of care and rigor, but also forms of kind of hanging out at the watering hole with that I can see in your first book too. But I'll hold on. I know there are other people waiting, so.
So while I sort of sift through the audience questions, one of the questions that I had, Naisargi, and I think Radhika sort of asked that already, is the relation between your first book and the second. And if you could sort of meditate on that for a few moments. I have many questions, many questions, but I think I'll start with this one.
Great question. I'm looking for. There is a moment in the interlude of the book where, and that chapter is just called Take a Walk with Me, and I'm walking with this fellow Dipesh, who is a field worker for welfare for stray dogs. And we come across this man, a barrister, who is nervously hovering as a dog is being treated on the sidewalk. And the page tells me, oh, this man is one of WSD's most important, just one of our clients, and he's really loves his dogs like his own children. And I came away and I was, sort of listening and humoring him and thinking, okay, this guy isn't just an animal lover, he's really gay. He's like a flaming homosexual. And I recognized him because I'm a flaming homosexual. And that led me to a moment where, maybe I'll just read this paragraph, because this to me is sort of the crux of what brings the first book and the second book together. In any case, whether or not the barrister was so gay, it was clear that he was lonely. And loneliness was what drove this world I knew most intimately of interspecies care. Loneliness and emptiness and grief, far more and more often than dogma. Men whose wives had died, women whose husbands had died, queer couples who had one or each been mistreated, queenie of closeted old single men, dykes whose praxis was forged as a rejection of the violent worlds of man and men, people alone, affect aliens from faraway galaxies. These people are not the ones who suck up all of the air, but they do, like Dipesh, walk the earth with attention, their errant paths carving grooves of grace. And to me, it's that sort of that quiet kinship between the queer and the animal that I think, is just a sensibility as well as an object of interest in both of the books.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful, Naisargi. I also have another question, which I think I can sort of put out there, which is that for me, what's incredibly sort of rich about your book is that, the sort of poetics of it as well, right? There's an aesthetic element, there's an ethnographic, but there's also kind of poetics, a queer poetics, that sort of refusing, but also refusing at the same time, precisely those categories as well, right? And that kind of stands out to me. And I wonder if this is, I'm kind of deliberately framing this as a broad question, like the relationship between curiosity, but also how do you see that sitting? Of course, it's an uneasy sort of coupling, if at all, but how does it sit with desire, longing, yearning, which also have something there, right? I mean, it's precisely what you're hitting at, I think, with Indifference. But how do you see these adjacencies? And if you had something to sort of say about that.
First of all, I love this idea of refusing and refusing. I think that's really interesting. We can talk a bit about that, or I can bring it into my answer to this question about longing and desire. which I think also relates back to the question of the connection between the queer book and the animal book. As I say in the first line, it's not an indifferent book. And I'm certainly not an indifferent person. I am deeply opinionated. And as I say in the contradiction chapter, I love having fights with people. And I believe very strongly in those arguments. And, that question of sort of the intellectual confrontation, but also the passionate attachment is deeply important to me. And someone asked me once if indifference is closer to I don't mind or I don't care. And I said, it's definitely not I don't mind. Indifference minds very, very much. Indifference is very opinionated. Indifference is very strong ethical beliefs, one could say. But it also cares, but it cares differently. And so this comes back to me. Sorry, I'm fusing a lot of questions. But when Radhika said, what is the ghost that haunts this book? Makes me think of another question that I'm often asked. This book clearly wants to change my mind about something. What does it want to change my mind about? And I would answer that by saying, if the book wants to change anyone's mind about anything, it's that in order to care about something, one has to care about the class to which that something ostensibly belongs, right? And so it wants to change its mind about care being conceptual and categorical as opposed to immanent, right? All then to say, Nikhil, in answer to your question, where is longing and desire? I think this book, it was for me and is for me, a book of real passionate investment. And so many of the people that I'm engaging, including the ascetics, are very, very passionate about their work, often in ways that are violent and reprehensible, and others in ways that just lead to a certain kind of quiet and personal exhaustion, right? But they are trying to ward off violent and reprehensible actions in the world, or what they seem to be. So I would, I guess, just conclude this by saying that indifference cares, but in relation to what I was saying about opacity earlier, there is always that freedom to become otherwise, right? So that care does not necessarily lead to a kind of solidity to the object or the relationship between subject and object, right? That care is always possibly becoming something otherwise, as opposed to becoming sort of sterile and solid, if that makes sense. The object of care is always in a certain kind of transformation, as well as the subject of that care.
Thank you. I mean, it's making me think, and I also have a kind of follow-up question that I kind of want to think with, which both has to do with the craft, because it's obviously there's an intentionality with the way you've crafted it, the way one might say you've curated, like elements and aspects of the book. But you're also, I think, urging us to, you're also sort of revealing, and anthropology is sort of culpable here, as well as, many other sort of disciplines, field formations, the hubris of attending and being attended to, you're also sort of urging us, in my reading, to just sort of approach the field, concepts, identity, politics with a capital P, with a kind of humility. And that humility is deeply political, and it's deeply implicated. It's deeply queer. It's deeply sort of non-normative, right? It's pushing the boundaries. And I wonder if you could say something, I mean, I'm thinking especially in relation to the chapter on touch and caste, right? And if you could say something in relation to that, particularly in the context of India, where touch or untouch is at kind of like at the heart of the caste question or paradox. To what extent were you thinking, or do you think indifference and repair, right, can sit together? And in what ways can this capacious mode of being with another, being adjacent to another, also sort of compel us to think of questions of repair in a different vein?
So one of the stories that I start, or that appears, I think, in the chapter on touch is this. The story, the book is full of these apocryphal stories. Whether they happened or not seems less important than the work that they do, the social life of the tellings and the retellings of them. And so one of these stories is about, and this appears in Kipling, it appears in Crystal Rogers, it appeared when I would have drinks with people, which is a bull is hit by a speeding lorry and thrown onto a man's farmland, right? He is clearly close to being dead, is profoundly suffering, but the landowner is refusing to shoot the bull because the bull lives on his land and he claims adherence to ahimsa, and he doesn't want to be responsible for the bull's death, right? I read that behavior on the part of the landowner as indifference in the vernacular sense, right? Where indifference means a kind of certainty of self that refuses to be exposed to the other, right? So where nonviolence becomes a refusal to touch or be touched, both figuratively and literally, right? So I use that alongside Javare's work to think about indifference in my sense, so the non-vernacular sense, in which indifference is fundamentally about the desire and the readiness to touch and be touched, to expose and be exposed, alongside with his idea of sociability, right? And that, so that's one of the ways in which I'm thinking about this question around touch, indifference, and exposure. Repair is an interesting concept too. Could you say a little bit more, Nikhil, about how you feel like that fits in and what you want me to say about that?
I just feel like, within thinking through sort of a sort of queer feminist vein, and thinking with my own sort of peregrinations in the field in India as a queer sort of anthropologist, I think that what you're saying is so true, in the sense of how desires are arranged, and how there is a, there's almost a kind of from a queer sort of lens, almost a kind of refusal of surfaces as given, right? Because the desire for transparency also presumes that subjects are legible just as a thing, or like an identity or a person, whereas one is constantly sort of, but one has to do work, some kind of work to think with that. But then when one has the flesh and when one has touch, that work is immediately embodied, it's visceral, right? That grammar is, it operates in a completely different way, and repair sort of operates through the body qua body, right? Like that's what I was also thinking, and your book was also provoking me to like think with that.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of putting it, Nikhil. And And it makes me think about, getting back to the pun around, the anus. The book is full of abscesses, wounds, empty spaces, negations, right? And if I'm thinking about how repair operates in and across the text, right? It's not through the idea of, it's through a certain kind of comfort, I think, with the absence, right? It's a comfort with both the form of thinking that is negation, as well as a comfort with not being in the ways that we normally associate with fullness, right? The fullness of a certain kind of political voice, or the fullness of a certain kind of vision of what's right or necessary. So when I talk about every moment being its own ethical universe, I think what's really challenging about Indifference, but to me what's really exciting about it, is that we don't know what repair means. Every moment as its own ethical universe means that we're not actually repairing, right? We're not returning to something before, right? But it presents its own opportunity for a new way of relating with another that probably doesn't look like whatever came before that moment.
Thank you. Kurt, I wonder if you had a question?
Yes. So actually, I love that way of thinking about repair, or actually really rethinking repair as an imperative. And it brings to mind a question I had just about how the book has been received in animal welfare spaces in India or elsewhere, which I think would also, in some cases, probably want to lean on a kind of sense of repair, actually, in some respects. So I wonder how, how this conversation that you are provoking, is a conversation that then about an ethic of indifference happens within spaces of animal welfare or rights. I know it's tough because we only have like a minute or two to respond, but I would love to hear even just a short anecdote about that.
Well, it goes against, in some ways, everything that we can think about activism as, right? Passionately attached to certain forms of politics and ideology, right? And at the same time, there is, I think, it has also been received with a certain kind of, there is very much a movement in animal politics in India, which has been so weighed down by its association, both real and not always accurate, with Hindutva violence, right? Which is a movement that I'll call, or that they call themselves, as the animal left, right? Which wants to fully reject, disengage in the most full-throated possible way with any association with those kind of fascistic foundations of animal politics, and especially anti-meat movements in India, right? And so there is a way in which this indifference politics is both born out of my conversations with those folks, and my co-writer in the chapter on cow protection, Alok Gupta, is one of those main interlocutors, who of course, Kurt, too, from our queer days. I guess we're still in our queer days, but but I feel like, so these conversations both emerge out of those debates with people, right, in which there wants to, there's a call for like a full rejection with the carcerality of animal rights politics more generally, and it's certainly the way in which they manifest in India. An absolute distancing and full-throated rejection of anti-meat movements and any kind of food fascism. And so Indifference provides a way, I think, of thinking about being deeply engaged with the world and caring about the world that also is centrally about non-interference, right? It's about the flourishing of human and non-human others, which includes total disengagement with the idea of thinking one knows best what other people should do with their times and mouths and relationships more generally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nais. That was I think also a really nice place to bring the conversation to an end, that we could keep talking about the book for much longer, I think. So I wanted to thank Naisargi, Kadri, Radhika, Nikhil. Thank you all for this conversation today. It's been really fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Pleasure.
You all.
Metala or Navia, I think we can end the session now.